What if I told you that the heart of your future car is effectively made in one country you don't control? Right now, when people say China controls 80% of EV batteries, they're talking about something deeper than just factories. They mean the mines, the refineries, the materials, and the companies that power the electric future. And here's the twist. This isn't just about Teslas, BYDs, or charging stations. It's about whether the United States can keep its economy, its military, and its energy transition running if that battery lifeline tightens. So, is China's battery dominance just smart industrial policy, or a real threat to the US? Let's start with the scoreboard. Chinese companies produce more than 3/4 of the world's EV batteries, and over 70% of all EV batteries ever manufactured were produced in China. China is also the world's electric car factory, building more than 70% of global electric car output in 2024. Two companies alone, KTL and BYD, account for roughly half of global EV battery production, and both are Chinese. In other words, if you lined up 10 EV battery packs, something like 8 of them, or the materials inside them, would trace back to China in some way. That's where the 80% idea comes from. An EV battery isn't one thing. It's a stack of critical minerals and components: lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, cathodes, anodes, and the cells themselves. China doesn't dominate every mine, but it dominates what happens after the ore leaves the ground. Analysts say China processes around 65% of the world's lithium, 85% of graphite, about 70% of cathode materials, and roughly 85% of anodes, including anode active materials. Other studies and policy briefs summarize it more bluntly. China controls upwards of 80% of the supply of key battery materials and components like graphite, cobalt, manganese, anodes, and cathode precursors. So even if your car is built in the US, the chemistry at its core is still heavily Chinese. That's the real 80%. Not just finished batteries, but the choke points in the supply chain. How did Washington end up here? For roughly 3 decades, China treated batteries and EVs as a strategic industry. It poured subsidies into factories, locked in mining deals through its overseas partnerships, and built an entire ecosystem of mineral processing, cell manufacturing, and vehicle production. Meanwhile, US policy was stop and go. Research grants came and went, incentives changed with administrations, and domestic battery projects often struggled to scale. The result, as one academic report for the US Department of Defense put it, is that China dominates the global battery supply chain end to end, while the United States is heavily dependent on Chinese inputs. In simple terms, China built the road while America was still arguing over the map. Here's where the question gets sharp. Is battery dependence just an economic annoyance or a true national security risk? US think tanks and security analysts warn that relying on China for critical minerals and battery components could expose the US to coercion, cyber risks, and disruptions that hit both civilian industries and defense equipment. Remember, batteries aren't just for cars. They power drones, communications gear, backup systems, and future military platforms. Some policy voices go even further, arguing that China has weaponized its battery dominance through non-market practices such as heavy subsidies and export leverage. But here's the nuance. Dependence is not the same as total control. The US still has alternative suppliers, growing domestic capacity, and the ability to pivot over time. So the threat is less they flip a switch and everything dies, and more they can raise costs, slow you down, and gain leverage at critical moments. Imagine a scenario. Overnight, Beijing announces tough new export controls on key battery materials and technologies. This is not impossible. China has already introduced or signaled export controls on graphite, some battery equipment, and certain lithium battery technologies in 2025. What happens? Battery prices could spike. US and European EV makers scramble for alternative suppliers. Projects depending on cheap Chinese cells stall. The energy transition timetable gets messier. Would EVs vanish? No. But the US would face an ugly proof of how much its clean energy plans still lean on a rival. And this is where the story flips. The US isn't just sitting still. In the last few years, US policy has shifted from "let the market decide" to "we need our own supply chain." The Inflation Reduction Act and related laws pour tens of billions of dollars into domestic battery plants, EV incentives, and critical mineral projects. Battery cell manufacturing capacity in the US jumped more than 45% in 2023 alone, and more gigafactories are under construction. Companies are also trying to chip away at Chinese dominance in key materials. In Tennessee, for example, Novonix is building one of North America's first large-scale synthetic graphite plants, specifically to reduce reliance on Chinese anode materials. All of this doesn't erase the gap overnight, but it means that by the late 2020s, the US and its allies could have a much more balanced battery map if projects stay on schedule. Here's an unexpected twist. China's battery dominance might also be a headache for China. Chinese firms have built so much capacity that some analysts talk about irrational competition and oversupply. Chinese officials themselves recently pledged to crack down on wasteful expansion and push manufacturers to expand overseas in a more orderly way. At the same time, global reports note that over 70% of all EV batteries ever made came from China, giving it deep know-how and cost advantages. So China sits in a strange position. It is both the battery superpower and potentially overexposed to market swings, technology shifts, and political backlash. That opens a quiet question. Will Beijing always want to weaponize batteries, or will it need the world's EV markets just as much as they need its factories? If you want to know whether this battery standoff escalates or cools down, watch a few key tracks. First, track how much of US and European EV battery demand is met by local factories versus Chinese imports by around 2030. The major energy and transport agencies publish regular outlooks on this. Second, keep an eye on new export controls or tariffs on battery materials and technologies from both China and Western governments. Third, follow breakthroughs in alternative chemistries like sodium-ion or solid-state batteries, which could reshuffle who controls which part of the supply chain. Any one of these could shift that 80% figure up, down, or sideways. So, is China's control over roughly 80% of the EV battery ecosystem a threat to the United States? It is clearly a vulnerability. China dominates battery materials, components, and cell manufacturing in ways that give it leverage over EVs, energy storage, and even some defense-related systems. It is also a wake-up call. Decades of consistent industrial strategy in Beijing have beaten decades of mixed signals in Washington, and now the US has to sprint just to close the gap. But it is not destiny. The US and its allies are rapidly building their own factories, securing alternative mineral supplies, and experimenting with new battery chemistries that could reduce single-country dependence over time. In the end, the real battle isn't just China versus the US. It's a race to build a clean energy system that is powerful, affordable, and resilient, where no single country can pull the plug. And the decisions made in this decade will decide whether that future feels like cooperation, competition, or a constant tug-of-war over the batteries that run our world.